One of the major questions in Western thought, as in many other traditions, is what are we? In particular, what is a human self? Socrates focused a lot on the dictum, know thyself, which had been imprinted in the Apollonian temple at Delphi. And that question, what exactly is the self, how do we know the self, has been a serious concern. Western religions, on the whole, answer the question, what is the self, at least by focusing on the individual human being. In many of these traditions, in most of the traditions, or at least some strands of these traditions, this self survives death and is a personal soul. That's what we're going to talk about in this lecture. What is this notion of the soul or the individual, perhaps it survives death? The notion of mind-body dualism is basically a theory that has had a lot of dominance in Western thought. The idea here is that the mind or the soul is one thing and the body is something else. It's not hard to see why this might come to people's minds. After all, if people die, the question is what happens to the soul? We still see the body there, but something drastic has changed. And one idea that suggests itself is the soul has gone to another place. I think one way or another, that's a very frequent way of putting that whole point. And so the idea is, well, which part of this is ourselves? In general, the West has sided with the mind or soul, suggesting that the mind is what is really essential to who we are, this soul that continues after death, and the body, although important while we're alive, is something that's less essential. It's not only the religious traditions that have tended to make a split between mind and body. The ancient Stoics, a school of thought that flourished in antiquity for really a number of centuries, beginning around the 4th century BCE, but extending into the early centuries CE, thought that it was really important that we could distinguish mind and body. Why? Because they thought that what we really ought to concern ourselves with is reaching a state of tranquility. So much of our lives, they thought, has all kinds of conflict involved in it. We tend to be very upset about things. We don't really live our lives as we should because we're always in some kind of turmoil. How do we overcome this? Their solution was to identify completely with the mind. People could do a lot of things to you externally. They could enslave you, not an uncommon problem among the Stoics. Nevertheless, in your mind, you are absolutely free. You could choose how to respond to that. You could decide to view yourself and your own identity as something completely separate from the way people treat you. And on the whole, that was the Stoic approach to things. Identify it with the mind, recognize our rationality as really what is divine in us, and be tranquil in life otherwise. The rather common saying, God grant me the wisdom to change those things I can change, not to try to change things I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference, is basically a Stoic motto. The Stoics thought as soon as we become clear on what it is that we do have control of, it's our own mind, but that's really control of everything that matters. In religious traditions, the notion of mind-body dualism is also important. In some Christian thinkers, for example, and this includes Augustine and Luther, mind and body not only are separate and operate somewhat independently, in a sense they're actually antagonists. Both Augustine and Luther thought that there was real danger that the flesh might overcome the spirit and lead the spirit astray. So not only did they accept a notion that the mind and body were separate, they tended to side with the spirit, their view of this soul or mind that's so important, against the flesh. Now, not all Christian thinkers tend to focus so much on there being a conflict, but nevertheless the fact that sometimes it seems that physically our body wants to do one thing and mentally we have other ideas is a recurrent problem in human experience. Suppose I want to be here alive and alert, but I got 2 hours sleep last night. Fortunately, not the case. Very likely my body is going to have different ideas about how the day should proceed than my mind is. Just those recurrent experiences where it seems that just physical facts about how we're doing that day affect what we can do struck a lot of people as really kind of a problem. Probably the classical statement of a dualism, the view that mind and body are separate things, came with Descartes. Descartes had the notion that what we really needed to do was solve the problem, actually, that we talked about in the last lecture. Why is it that human beings make mistakes, and how can we overcome that? His solution to how to go about this was to try to figure out if there were any things we couldn't be mistaken about. Now, certainly, he thought there are a lot of things we think generally work pretty well, beliefs that we haven't seen disproven yet. And so he points out that, indeed, there are some things I'm mistaken about, but I certainly don't feel myself to be mistaken about sitting here in front of a fire, writing, contemplating all these things. But then it occurs to him, wait, maybe I can't be so sure about that. After all, last night I dreamed something not really so dissimilar to this. I thought I was sitting in my living room, watching my fire, thinking about philosophy, and actually, I don't now think any of that was real. So how can I tell the difference? His proposal was that we adopt what he calls methodological skepticism. Now, both of those words are important here, so I'm going to take them one by one. Skepticism is a strategy of doubt. There are some philosophers who are called skeptics because their main method was doubting or challenging things taken for granted. In a way, that's not entirely different from what I said last time Socrates was concerned with. And Plato similarly, challenging some things that really are taken for granted. But nevertheless, the skeptics go pretty far into this direction, and many contend that we really can't assert anything positively. In a sense, they have a doctrine, namely that everybody else who asserts anything as a definite truth is wrong. Now, Descartes is very far removed from a skeptic of that sort. He himself thinks that there are actually quite a few things that we can say with absolute authority that we know, whereas a skeptic is someone who claims that the only thing that we know is that we don't know. So what he proposes is not skepticism of that sort, but methodological skepticism. In other words, we have a method that proceeds as if we're skeptics and just sees how far we can push this idea that we're really not so certain of what we think we are. And he asks the question, what can I be certain of? So we find that out by figuring out many things that we cannot be certain of. And as the dreaming example points out, a lot of things that we take to be pretty obvious in the here and now actually might be dreamed. How do we know we're not dreaming? Descartes thinks, of course, one of the reasons to think that we know some things is that, after all, we believe in God. This is an absolute assumption of Descartes' way of proceeding. And his view is that not only does he believe in God, but that God is good. So we can't really assume that God is trying to confuse us. That would kind of work against the idea that God is good and cares about his creatures. So he proposes a thought experiment. Instead of thinking about God having anything to do with how we come to know things, what our senses are, let us consider another powerful being, not as powerful as God, not as good as God, indeed not good at all, but nevertheless a being with a lot of power that can have an impact on us. And this being he calls, it's variously translated, an evil genius or an evil demon. And what this demon's claim to fame is that it systematically confuses us. This is what Descartes says in his Meditations. I will suppose, therefore, that not God, who is supremely good and the source of truth, but rather some malicious demon of the utmost power and cunning, has employed all of his energies in order to deceive me. I shall think that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things are merely delusions of dreams which he has devised to ensnare my judgment. I shall consider myself as not having hands or eyes or flesh or blood or senses, but as falsely believing that I have all these things. I shall stubbornly and firmly persist in this meditation, and even if it is not in my power to know any truth, I shall at least do what is in my power, that is, resolutely guard against assenting to any falsehoods, so that the deceiver, however powerful and cunning he may be, will be unable to impose on me in the slightest degree. Okay, now this is a very strange experiment. The idea is we basically consider all the things that we believe on the basis of our experience, and one by one decide this is wrong. So I imagine I have a body. Okay, Descartes says, well, let's imagine that that's wrong. I think I have a hand here. Let's imagine that I don't. Now, all this might seem a little bit odd, but one of the things that fascinates him in considering what we do and don't know is phantom limb syndrome, the situation that occurs when people have a limb amputated and yet they nevertheless still feel sensations that suggest to them that there is a limb there. It's a phantom limb. Descartes suggesting, imagine this powerful being that's able to convince us that we have the experiences of hands and legs and feet and so on, but nevertheless, we really don't. If you think about dreaming, it becomes a little bit clearer maybe how this might happen. A lot of times we think we're doing things. We're driving down the road, walking down the street, sometimes even flying. And when we wake up, we think, well, none of that really happened. I was lying here in bed all the time. So the experiment of the evil demon is we try to imagine all of these things being wrong. Not only the fact of doing those things, but the fact of having a body at all. And we have this imagination that the things that we see around us are also somehow faulty. For example, you might say, in fact, I've had the experience of seeing someone's new car in the dark in a parking lot. And the next day I see it and it's a completely different color. Well, my quick reaction to that is it really isn't a different color, but the light has changed. Now I see what the color actually is. In the case of the evil demon experiment, though, we always see the wrong color. Even if various lights seem to change the color, all those colors are wrong. In other words, it seems that there are all kinds of things that we're completely wrong about. And Descartes asks, is there anything in our experience that we know we're not mistaken about? He concludes that there's at least one thing that we know we're not mistaken about. He knows he is not mistaken about the fact that he himself exists. This is what he says. If I convince myself of something, then I certainly existed. I am, I exist, is necessarily true whenever it is put forward by me or conceived in my mind. Okay, what does he mean? Well, if I am engaged in this thought process of the evil genius, something seems to be going on. Obviously, I am thinking. I am considering this thought experiment. And insofar as I'm thinking, I'm aware of the fact that I'm thinking. Although I might consider any sense impression that I have, or any belief I have about what I'm doing otherwise, the one thing that I can be sure of is that I'm thinking. I couldn't be talking about it or articulating this to myself unless thinking were going on. So what he concludes is the one thing that is the absolute bedrock of certainty in this case is the fact that I am here. I am here as a thinking substance. Now note, this is a very interesting definition of the self. Many of us would think a lot of other things are relevant to us besides the fact that we're thinking. I think most of us think the disposition of our bodies is not entirely irrelevant to ourselves. But even if we want to focus on other things, the fact that I'm female rather than male strikes me as having something to do with my identity. The fact that I have emotions seems to have something to do with my identity, what I care about. Now, perhaps you can include these sorts of concerns in thinking to a certain extent, but that's not the way that Descartes tends to go. He has a very, you might say, thin sense of what self is. All that's required is that one is a thinking substance. What he concludes from this, of course, is quite a bit more. He is not willing to rest content with the fact that he knows he exists. People that we might consider pretty mad also believe that they themselves exist. They might just question whether anybody else does. And that doesn't strike us as really appropriate, or at least not good epistemology if all you conclude is your own existence. So Descartes spends a lot of time discussing how it is that we can conclude, now that we have at least one certain thing, that other things exist as well. His basic strategy is to say, as a thinking thing, I am rational. And as a rational being, there are some things that I can know just on the basis of that. He believes that mathematics is a paradigm case of what it is to know something. So, for example, all I need to do is be a thinking being, a rational being, and I can recognize the truth of 2 + 2 = 4. So long as I know what the concepts are, there's a clarity that comes to my mind when I think of that conception, 2 + 2 = 4, and that's something that, again, I can recognize to be true. The senses are a little bit more problematic for reasons that Descartes considers early on, but nevertheless, he's convinced that there really isn't a problem with the senses either. Why? Because we don't believe in an evil demon, we believe in a good God. He comments, "It is impossible that God should ever deceive me, for in every case of trickery or deception, some imperfection is to be found. And although the ability to deceive appears to be an indication of cleverness or power, the will to deceive is undoubtedly evidence of malice or weakness, and so cannot apply to God. And since God does not wish to deceive me, he surely did not give me the kind of faculty which would ever enable me to go wrong while using it correctly." What he's claiming is that although the evil genius experiment imagines some creature powerful enough to mislead us in all kinds of ways, this would be completely inconsistent with the definition of God. That God doesn't have any such motivation, that indeed having such a motivation is an imperfection. And God, being the most perfect being, doesn't suffer from the need to deceive people. I mean, if you think about human beings who try to deceive people, why do they try to deceive people? Well, often because of some kind of weakness that they have. Maybe they want to get something from the person because they feel some kind of lack. That's not going to apply to God. Maybe they want to deceive somebody because they feel the need to indicate that they're much more powerful than people tend to think them to be. In other words, they feel inferior. God has no motivation of that sort either. So God doesn't have the kind of motivations that we see in people who want to deceive, and those are always born of some kind of weakness. In contrast, God is perfect and also perfectly good. So anything that he's given us as a basic faculty for orienting ourselves is something good too. The way we go astray is basically some problem of our own. One problem is we don't always know how to interpret what we get through the senses. In fact, some of this has to do simply with the fact that we have bodies and are structured as we are. One of the reasons that people have phantom limb syndrome is that some of the nerves that are used to connect an attached arm to our minds or to the rest of us, allowing us to interpret sensory experience, some of those nerves are still active. And it's the same nerve endings that end up, or actually connections to the central nervous system, that end up giving us the impression of a limb when there isn't one there. So it's basically the fact that we're extended bodies that allows us to be a little bit confused as to whether the sensation is coming from a closer point on the same nerve or further out, at my fingertips, say. That's an indication that indeed God made us right, made us well, designed us very ingeniously, but nevertheless sometimes the input that comes in through the senses is misinterpreted by us, and for reasons having to do just with our misunderstanding of what the location of certain kind of sensory data comes from. Also, and this is perhaps the most important from Descartes' point of view, even though the senses can mislead us in certain ways, and he does think there are structural explanations that can be given, God has given us a faculty that allows us to figure out that we've been misled. So, for example, if we think back to the cave painter who had been very impressed by the fact that at a distance animals look very tiny, one could conclude from that that animals that one's seeing at a great distance are in fact very tiny. But as we have more experiences and start to weigh our experiences together, we start to recognize, no, it's not that the animals are tiny, it's that this is an effect of perspective. We can use our minds, our reason, to compare different situations where we've seen what seems to be the same animal at a distance, and we notice it seeming to get larger as it comes toward us. Reason thinks there's a pattern here. This has something to do with distances. We can figure it out in a systematic way. So God gives us what Descartes calls the natural light of reason, and that allows us to overcome what otherwise might lead us into error. So it's certainly not God's fault when we make a mistake. It's that we ourselves have failed to use our reason properly to try to integrate these various experiences together and figure out what the system is. Now, this whole notion of mind-body dualism is actually even called after Descartes in Western thought. It's called Cartesian dualism. We've got two substances, something that is extended, the body, something that dies, and the mind, the soul, the thinking thing, something that endures beyond death. And the big question that the whole theory raises and doesn't entirely answer is, how do these two things work together? Descartes is more concerned, since he assumes that in fact they are both conjoined while we're alive and separate when we're dead, he assumes that this is something that most people are going to agree to, that it's not really such a problematic notion. Most people just in common sense take for granted that the mind ceases to be there when a person dies, even though there is still a corpse. Okay, so when people are alive, how do they get together? Basically, Descartes seems pretty comfortable with leaving this to God. God conjoins them and at some point separates them again. One of the things that's interesting from the standpoint of Western thought leading up to this is that Descartes is really attempting to explain this complicated phenomena of mind and body partly in terms of substances. Again, to look back at the Greeks, some of the ideas we were talking about in a previous lecture, there is an idea that, okay, things change, things interact, sometimes we're confused about things because they change, but nevertheless there's some basic substance that underlies these various phenomena. Well, Descartes, again, is looking for a substance. He's saying, what allows us to make sense of things? In this case, it's this mental substance, this thinking thing. At the same time, what partially confuses us? The fact that this thinking substance is conjoined with another substance, a substance that takes up space, has a particular perspective, whereas reason allows us to get out of the limitations of a perspective and see a broader picture. Descartes was very influential in Western thought, particularly in connection with epistemology, or at least what we've been talking about concerns epistemology. Epistemology, again, being theory of knowledge. Descartes' view is that this natural light of reason that God gives us is what is profoundly crucial. In other words, how do we come to know things? Well, certainly we take things in through the senses, but we have to use reason to figure out whether or not what our initial impression is accurate. We have to sort out information that comes to us through the senses, and we do that by means of reason. Now, this is one way that modern Western thought has gone, and Descartes' view in this respect is a very decided, canonical kind of view for many people. It's called rationalism. Reason is our primary mode of knowledge. On the other hand, some of the later thinkers, particularly in England, tended to think, or in Britain generally, tended to think that we ought to pay a little bit more attention to the senses than Descartes suggests. That actually there's nothing that we know that hasn't come to us by means of the senses in some basic way. And of course, once we get this information through the senses, we do need to compare different data that we've got and deal with deficiencies that arise. But nevertheless, we don't really have a problem because of the senses. The problem comes actually with reason's ability to sort this all out. Now, of course, you might say, well, this is kind of a debate that's really just a matter of emphasis. And in a way it is. Descartes saying we get information through the senses, but reason has to sort things out, and that's what's really important. The empiricists are saying reason has to sort out what comes in through the senses, but it should never lose touch with exactly what the senses are taking in. It is really a kind of question of emphases. But in both cases, there is a notion that there's an important role for reason to play, and that the self that we're really concerned with is fundamentally allied with reason. And if we do ally our senses with the self, we have to take that reason into account. The most revolutionary of modern thinkers, Immanuel Kant, builds on the kind of distinction that we've been talking about between a realm of the senses and the realm of the mind in a more transcendent sense, in his dramatic account, which he calls his own Copernican revolution. You might remember that Copernicus is the theorist, the astronomer, who proposed that, in fact, though up till his time people had believed that the sun went around the earth, it was really the other way around, that the earth revolves around the sun. And Kant suggests that he's proposing something as dramatic when he claims that we really need to recognize how much we do the shaping of the world that we understand ourselves. Now, I'm going to take this somewhat slowly, so please bear with me. There's a bit of terminology. Kant uses a distinction that he makes between what he calls the phenomenal world, which means the world that we experience, just what we see around us, and the noumenal world, which he views as the world in reality, but something that none of us have ever experienced. Why haven't we experienced it? I think to make the point these days, maybe the best analogy is to think of computers. Suppose you have a computer and you want to get a floppy disk, at least if you have a computer that still uses floppy disks, and you decide what kind of floppy disk you want to buy. Some are pre-formatted for IBM, some are pre-formatted for Macintoshes, and if you get the wrong kind of formatting, you might have some trouble with your computer. Why? Because it can only read things in a certain format. Kant's view is that when we talk about sensory experience, what we're really doing is talking about the formatting that our own minds give to things. We can only interpret things in certain kinds of shapes because those are the shapes that our senses give it. Now, he's in a way mimicking some of the earlier theories where the senses take things in, but he's adding a completely new dimension here. It's not that we are passively receiving data from the senses. We are actively formatting the data, and what we rationally understand, or he would use a rather different word, mentally understand, experientially recognize, is only the fact that these things occur in the formats that our minds provide. This is why the phenomenal world and the noumenal world, although the fundamental reality is the same, end up being rather different. The phenomenal world is the world after our minds have already formatted things. It's what we know. We can't ever get loose of the fact that we format things as we do. The noumenal world, on the other hand, is the world as it is without our intervention at all. If we had never existed, presumably the noumenal world, the world in reality, would still be there. But when we want to know what the world is like, we can only do that by means of the faculties that we have. We can't read anything until we've formatted it ourselves in certain kinds of ways. Now, the fact that we can't do that means two things. One, that we can really only know things phenomenally. In other words, we only know things as they're already shaped by our own minds. I think maybe another comparison can be made with the kind of exhibits one sometimes sees in a science museum, a kind of exhibit that is hands-on and I think especially appealing to children, where you, for instance, look through some glasses and see what the world would look like to a fly. And you see all kinds of different repetitions of the image of the world that you see. And you come away thinking, gee, it would be really different to be a fly. Of course, you probably already thought that, but this is a new particular way of thinking of how different it would be. Or if there's a similar kind of exhibit talking about suggesting what it would be like to navigate by means of sonar, as bats do. Again, there's an impression of just how completely different the world must be to a bat than it is to us. Well, again, what this draws into focus is the fact that we ourselves have a certain way of taking the world in. And that's what Kant views as essential to understanding what sensory experience is like for us. We only know the world as our faculties, as our senses take it in, and our mind gives it shape. At the same time, we don't think that our minds make it all up. Our minds are, in fact, reading something. They are recognizing things in the world. There's a basis of connection between what we experience and the way the world is in itself, but we just really can't say what that's like. We can only say what things are like as they appear to us. Now, we ourselves are also both. We ourselves have an appearance to other people, even to ourselves, as being phenomena. I see my hand just as I see a table or see the podium. Again, I use my own faculties to understand myself, but we know that's not the whole story. In reality, we also have a dimension that is comparable to what the world is like in itself. And that dimension is the truest sense of self from Kant's point of view. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next lecture.